Some thoughts on life, nature, philosophy, yoga, religion, atheism, Buddhism, non duality, art, music, and wellness. Mostly positive looks at things that will hopefully give you a moment to pause and a moment to take a breath. Should you do yoga? Of course, I can't answer that question exactly, whether or not you should do yoga. But I would like to just talk about some big picture overview things about yoga today that I have found practicing for about 5 years. And one of the ideas with this podcast is to try to keep things simple, to keep them relatively short at this point, and to have hopefully a podcast that gives you information that's helpful and not too complicated. I find that as people are seeking philosophies and spirituality and things like that, I've noticed that there are a lot of very complex systems out there. And sometimes that's fun to go down a long, complex, challenges of the mind. And, it's nice to have something to think about, something that you're working on, your brain's working on. And I think that can be useful. But I also love the idea of having simple things that I found that are helpful to me and just sharing those. And that's kind of what this podcast is about. So, what is yoga? Let's start there real quick. You know, it can mean a lot of things. Not only are there a lot of different styles of yoga, but also some of the original older texts, such as the Yoga Sutra, when they use the word yoga, when that was written, they're really probably talking about a seated sitting meditation. So the posture was probably just sitting. The yoga really meant a form of meditation. But what I'm going to be discussing today is really what's known as the asana, mostly is what I'm going to talk about. And asana is another word for posture. So it's what we in modern society typically think of as yoga, meaning you're moving you're moving from one posture to another, or you're stretching or something of that nature. So I'm going to talk today mostly about the asana version. And I think it's interesting to look at so when I say yoga, that's mostly what I'm talking about, unless I clarify, but it's interesting to look at why do people do yoga. So the title of this podcast will either be should we be doing yoga, or why do people do yoga? And in my practice and in talking with others and observations over a few years now of doing yoga, these are some of the things I've noticed. These are some of the things that people have told me as to why they do yoga. One is to maintain strength or increase strength. So some of these asana postures, like a vinyasa yoga, or some of these, you're doing a lot of things that can increase your strength. Another is to maintain or increase flexibility. I think those two are very common. And of course, someone may be doing yoga for all of these reasons I'm listing. They could be all combined, one or several. I think strength and flexibility are typically pretty high on the list. And yoga's pretty good for that. Again, in my observation, I can only talk really from my experience and having talked to a lot of other people that practice on a regular basis. Not perfect for all those things, but pretty good system. You may need to, maybe if you're doing some sort of form of yoga where there's a lot of these sort of push ups, you might need to strengthen your shoulders a little bit with some strength training to be able to do those a lot. Or if you've got you want to try to get into a handstand or something like that, you may need to build your core strength, a little bit more with some outside exercise to achieve something like that. But in general, it's pretty good at maintaining or increasing strength, and it's pretty good at maintaining or increasing flexibility. Another reason I see is social connections. This is, I think, can be a pretty big one for a lot of people. Some people, not at all, and other people like the social element of practicing with a bunch of people and maybe even talking to people that are sort of on the same wavelength as you are. I'm looking at my list here, and the next one says sweat and get a workout. So if you're doing some sort of, particularly if you're doing some sort of hot yoga or warm yoga or something like that, there can be a lot of sweating involved. So, um, and if you're doing kind of a flow kind of exercise where you're doing something like a vinyasa flow or one of these, or um, another one is Ashtanga, one of these forms where, it's physically very challenging, or a hot sequence yoga. Um, can involve a lot of sweating. And I have talked to people that's what they like the most. They really like coming in and just, sweating a ton. And it makes them feel good afterwards. And there's sort of I think a physical and sort of psychological representation of all the work you've just put in, pooling up on the floor there. So that's that's I think something that people really enjoy. Another thing that I see a pretty good bit and have experienced myself is as a means of physical therapy, working on an injury or physical issue. I had a pinched nerve in the bottom of my spine, sort of a compromised disc, which caused the left half of my body to, particularly the left leg, to go numb for a period of time. Went to a doctor. They prescribed physical therapy, and basically, which is the strengthening of the muscles in this case, and hopefully the elongating of the spine in such a way as to relieve some pressure on that nerve and things of that nature. And what I've found is that what I did in physical therapy is a lot of it's really similar to what we do in some of the styles of yoga. Not all of them, but some of them. So, as a means of, if you come into yoga with an injury and you're approaching it very carefully, I think it can be a means of physical therapy and as a means of working on an injury. You can also some of the physical practices are very challenging and very difficult. You can also injure yourself doing yoga if you're not careful, and you can also make an injury worse. So you have to be mindful about this as a means of a moving meditation or breathing practice. I think this is a big one. The more and more you do yoga, it becomes a type of moving meditation, or it can become a type of moving meditation. It becomes a breathing practice. And if you're moving and you're focusing on your breathing, which is that's kind of the fundamental part of the asana practice, the modern asana practice as I see it. Asana, again, just meaning the postures, the vinyasa flow or the sequenced movements or what have you. Many yoga teachers say that it's a breathing practice first, and the asanas are there to sort of reinforce what you're doing with the breath. So I see that part of it as a means of a moving meditation and a breathing practice. To me, that is a very important part of it and one of the most important parts of it. Another reason that people might try yoga, do yoga, is as a way of dealing with trauma. Recent statistics say that more than 80% of us, according to the standards that psychologists, psychiatrists use to indicate trauma, that more than 80% of us have experienced trauma in our lives. One of the ways that this practice might help with things like that is by increasing your ability to sleep, increasing your overall calmness, decreasing anxiety. And the meditative aspect that I was talking about earlier, the breathing and meditative aspect, can give you the ability to pause, or sometimes it's referred to as the gap, to have a bit of a gap between the things that happen to us in life and that moment of reactivity. The last thing I want to talk about in this episode is to give you a few tips of things that I have found useful to me, particularly if you've never done yoga before. If the studio offers a non-heated, sort of yoga 101, or just non-heated version of whatever you're going to practice, or just any sort of non-heated class, I would say go in and do some of those before you jump into the heated room. And then when you do decide to jump into the heated room, or maybe you're in really good shape and you sweat a lot, say you're a runner and you're like, yeah, the heated will be fine for me. Uh, bring water, bring water with electrolytes, and make sure you're hydrated before you get into the class, and take breaks as you need to. Some of the old sort of traditional forms of yoga, you might have a really traditional teacher in a specific style who's like, you can't drink water during class. It's, because it cools the body down and you're supposed to be heating yourself up. And you can't take a break, and if you take a break, then just leave class. So I think that these kind of attitudes are fading, and you probably won't see them as much as you would have 10 years ago, but they're still out there. Be aware of that. Do what's best for your body and mind. There's a style called yin yoga, and yin is pretty much all on the floor. It's just stretching, and you hold the stretch for an extended period of time. This is great for sort of a meditative practice, and it's also really good if you want to stretch out the body. Got to be a little bit careful with this if you have an injury, because oftentimes you don't warm up ahead of time. But it can be a great addition to practice that you're already doing. There's another one you might want to try. If you see a class that's a restorative class tends to use a lot of props and tends to try to get you in a really comfortable position where you can then maybe stretch very, very easily and slowly. So let's say you're like, you're lying on a set of pillows where maybe there's one at the arch of your back, so you're doing a very easy and subtle back stretch, and you lay there for a few minutes and you meditate, and you're typically in a very comfortable state, and there's nice music playing and maybe some incense, and it's a great if you want to chill and meditate, if you want to work on the body in that kind of nurturing way. There's a style called Ashtanga, and if you want to really work hard and get into something where they recommend that you practice 6 days a week, and the practice is very challenging physically, and it's this similar a series of set postures. You kind of do the same postures every time. If that appeals to you, you might check that out. And vinyasa, when you see that word, it typically means that you're going to move and kind of get some cardio. You're going to be moving a good bit. It's going to be kind of different than the last vinyasa class you took, probably. It's going to change a little bit. It might be in a heated room, it might not. And it's great for building strength, balance, cardio, and you'll get a good workout. If you go to a studio and you're practicing in person as opposed to online, just remember that there are probably a lot of different teachers and a lot of different classes. And so if you go to one and maybe you don't love the instructor or love the class, try a different one. That's the reason that they have so many different classes and different instructors, because not every instructor is for every person. So I have found that, like a lot of things in life, you're kind of looking for someone that you think you pair well with, that you like their style and you like their personality and you like the way that they lead you through the practice. So, should you do yoga? Back to the original question. And I guess if you're interested in any of the reasons that I've mentioned that one might do yoga, then I would say it's worth checking out. You know, uh, in the broader sense of the word yoga, yoga can really be anything that gets you in a focused state of mind. So, yogis will talk about this sort of advanced idea that when you're doing that thing that you love to do and you're in the flow, you're doing yoga. That could be something physical or not. It could be running. It could be playing a musical instrument. It could be a yoga flow. It could be anything that gets you in the zone or in the flow with increased clarity of mind.